O.T.O, shall be the whole of the law.
Love is the law, love the will.
Welcome everyone to Blazing Star Oasis. As Michael just said, my name is Neil. I am the master of Blazing Star Oasis. And I want to give everyone just a general introduction to who we are and what we do here really briefly, just in case people aren't familiar. So Blazing Star Oasis is a chartered body of Ordo Templi Orientis, O.T.O, which is a fraternal organization dedicated to promulgating the law of Thelema. And the activities of our oasis are primarily twofold. So on the one hand, we have the EGC, or Ecclesia Gnostica Catholica, which is the church of the O.T.O, and we celebrate Gnostic Masses here every Sunday. So if you're interested in coming and checking out a Mass on Sunday, doors open at 3:30 and we begin at 4:30. The other thing we do here is under the umbrella of MMM, or Mysteria Mystica Maxima, which offers progressive initiations into the mysteries of O.T.O. And if anybody is interested in learning more about that, you can come talk to me afterwards, or Keith or Celeste, and we would be happy to provide you more information about that. So without any further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Michael, who will be introducing our panel.
Great, thank you. Tonight's panel discussion will be about Thelema and the decriminalization of sex work. Thelema is, once again, the Greek word for will and the centerpiece of the philosophy, way of life, even religion established by Aleister Crowley back in the early 20th century. These quotes here are from the Liber Legis, the book of the law that was dictated to Crowley by a being who was either a part of his deep unconscious mind or a preternatural intelligence. He kind of went back and forth on which one. I think explanations of these may come up a little later, but I felt they were appropriate for the theme. So I'm not going to go into explaining them right now, but you can just kind of take them in. What I do want to get into is the primary issue of the FOSTA-SESTA bill. So SESTA is, as it says there, the Stop Enabling Sex Traffickers Act. And it was coupled with the Allow States and Victims to Fight Online Sex Trafficking Act, or FOSTA. I took this from Wikipedia, which succinctly describes it here. On February 27th, 2018, that's this year, FOSTA-SESTA package was passed in the House of Representatives with a vote of 388 to 25. So this was bipartisan. It was not a matter of Republicans or theocrats out to get us. This was across the board. On March 21st, 2018, the FOSTA-SESTA package bill passed in the Senate with a vote of 97 to 2, with only Senators Ron Wyden and Rand Paul voting against it. The bill was signed into law by President Donald Trump on April 11th, 2018. And so, I just a show of hands, who here has heard of this before? Just about everybody. Okay. So what does it do? What does FOSTA-SESTA do? Because that sounds nice to stop sex trafficking. This is from a rather long article by Vox. If you put FOSTA-SESTA into Google, it's the very first thing that keeps popping up, and it's a pretty thorough article. So here's a description of this bill from that article. The bills also poke a huge hole in a famous and long-standing safe harbor rule of the internet, Section 230 of the 1996 Communications Decency Act, usually shorthanded as Section 230, and generally seen as one of the most important pieces of internet legislation ever created. It holds that no provider or user of an interactive computer service shall be treated as the publisher or speaker of any information provided by another information content provider. In other words, Section 230 has allowed the internet to thrive on user-generated content without holding the platforms and the ISPs responsible for whatever those users might create. Just like newspapers used to say, we are not responsible for what is written in our editorials. But FOSTA-SESTA creates an exception to Section 230 that means website publishers would be responsible if third parties are found to be posting ads for prostitution, including consensual sex work, on their platforms. The goal of this is supposed to be that policing online prostitution rings gets easier. What FOSTA-SESTA has actually done, however, is create confusion and immediate repercussions among a range of internet sites as they grapple with the ruling's sweeping language. The article also goes on to say, in the immediate aftermath of SESTA's passage on March 21st, 2018, numerous websites took action to censor or ban parts of their platforms in response, not because those parts of the sites actually were promoting ads for prostitutes, but because policing them against the outside possibility that they might was just too hard. So Craigslist got rid of their personal ads, for instance. And they went after Backpage because Backpage had tried to make sure that ads that were posted did not say anything about child trafficking. So this is an attempt to show they do not want this on our site, but they used that against them, saying, well, this shows that they know what was going on. They're just trying to hide it even more. So it's like you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. All of this bodes poorly for the internet as a whole. After all, as many opponents of the bill have pointed out, the law doesn't appear to do anything concrete to target illegal sex trafficking directly, and instead threatens to increase violence against the most marginalized. But it does make it a lot easier to censor free speech on small websites, as evidenced by the immediate ramifications the law has had across the internet. So originally the big companies like Google and Microsoft were opposed to this. Once the language is tweaked just a little bit, then they were all on board. And further on in the Vox article, they point out that it makes it easier to go after the small guys, whereas the big guys, Google, Microsoft, can easily protect themselves. So it's a way of just getting rid of the competition. Or that's one possible outcome. Of course, nobody will cop to that as their motivation. So here I have invited 3 panelists to join us tonight to talk about this, the social, legal, and even the thelemic ramifications of all this. Because this has, let me be clear, Thelema does not support coercive sex or exploitation of anyone, and especially not of children. Anyone who's read more deeply into Crowley's writings, or even not that deeply, his explanations of the Book of the Law, published as The Law is for All, has long sections on this, which I can pull up if needed to further on. But what Thelema is about is the right of people to live as they choose, to follow their own nature, to discover their true will in life, and to not have that interfered with. And consensual sex between adults was definitely be part of that. And what FOSTA-SESTA does is it is a government attempt to interfere with the true will and sexual expression of consenting adults in the name of, oh, but the children, right? Mm-hmm. But it doesn't even really protect the children. And then what it does is, it's not even clamping down on illegal stuff, it's even making it so that personal ads, the small websites can't even host personal ads. It makes it more difficult for, well, I don't want to get into things I'm sure the panelists will cover, but you see where I'm going with this. This is a broader issue of, our freedoms to live as we choose and not have the government try to police, our actions and behavior as private citizens. So let me introduce the panelists. First, we have Miriam Green, who is, as she wrote, an accidental kink educator for Wicked Grounds. That's a coffee shop in Soma, which is a delightful place to go to. And the Society of Janus. Maybe some of you have heard of that organization. A longtime Thelemite, and the owner of, so it says owner of Wicked Grounds, and San Francisco's Kink Cafe and Boutique. And there's the website for it. Also with us is Starchild, in the middle there, a companion, erotic service provider, libertarian activist in San Francisco, run for public office several times, in a variety of capacities, served in a variety of capacities of the Libertarian Party, including an elected representative on the Libertarian National Committee and organizer of the Decriminalization meetup group for people seeking to abolish laws and regulations restricting consensual sex work. And then also we have Carol Leight, aka Scarlot Harlot, artist and sex work activist since the late 70s, who apparently you coined the term, you're taking credit for coining the term sex work. Yes.
Haven't heard anybody dispute it. I think she's
All right.
pedigree.
So her activism spans decades as a Coyote member, a founding member of ACT UP and SWAP, co-founder of the Bay Area Sex Worker Advocacy Project, or bayswan.org. She's performed internationally as Scarlot Harlot, including several years touring with the Sex Worker Art Show. In 1999, she founded San Francisco Sex Worker Film and Arts Festival, sexworkerfest.com. Is that the same one that's involved with that theater and admission?
Roxy, yes.
Roxy gives out the rewards? That's you. All right, excellent. She's worked closely with is it Desiree Alliance, supporting an intersectional, economic, racial, gender justice emphasis with the sex workers' rights movement for several years. She's been focusing on this library and the collection of work, Collateral Damage, Sex Workers and the Anti-Trafficking Campaigns. And there's a website for that as well. So these are our panelists. Let's give them a hand for
Oh, I'm
next,
sorry.
one last thing.
Oh.
So I wanted to say a little bit of something about the Thelemic angle. Like, why do we, well, not everybody here is a Thelemite, perhaps, but why do we as Thelemites care about this? Why are we hosting this?
Why should we?
Why should we? Right.
Yeah.
So this is a small writing called Liberties, or Book 77, written by Carol Leight to function as a kind of manifesto for human rights from the Thelemic angle. And it has a bunch of quotes from the Book of the Law of the strong, this is our law, the joy of the world. Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law. Thou hast no right but to do thy will, do that, and no other shall say nay. And every man and every woman is a star. So all this stuff about doing your will also means you recognize the right of other people to do their will, and that we recognize that each of us is a star. We're trying to bring out that light from within ourselves and everyone else.
Absolute.
Right. And then you get into Liber Oz itself. It says, there is no God but man. Man has the right to live by his own law, to live in the way that he wills to do, to work as he will, to play as he will, to rest as he will, to die when and how he will. Man has the right to eat what he will, to drink what he will, to dwell where he will, to move as he will on the face of the earth. Man has the right to think what he will, to speak what he will, to write what he will, to draw, paint, carve, etch, mold, build as he will, to dress as he will. Man has the right to love as he will. Take your fill and will of love as ye will, when, where, and with whom ye will. Man has the right to kill those who would thwart these rights. And then two more quotes in the Book of the Law, the slave shall serve, and love is the law, love under will. Now, admittedly, this may come off as a bit harsh, and we can get into that and how we Thelemites actually understand it, because obviously we're not going around killing anybody who gets in our way. So there's some nuance to this. Most of us, yes. But I think it shows, it clearly to me, it shows where we would come down on the side of issues having to do with immigration, euthanasia, the rights of sex workers, and consensual sexuality. And I think that's all that I am going to or need to say about that at this time. And I'm sure at least Mir on our panel may take up a little bit more of that. And I'm hoping that we're going to give each panelist 20 minutes to speak. So that should take about an hour roughly, and there should still be enough time to have questions, answers, and comments, and hopefully have a lively discussion about this. So without any further ado, I will now hand over the discussion to Carol Leight. And
I think I'll just intro my little video thing first, and it's the one that says deconstructing.
Deconstruct, okay.
I stand up better than I sit. Is that going to be okay? Is there? I didn't hear that one.
Do it that way.
That's the feminist theory one, right?
Yes.
Okay.
But not quite yet. Let me just introduce it a
Okay.
little. And am I in an okay place? And can I be here?
Are you?
Okay, good. Thank you so much for organizing this, and thank you so much for inviting me. I'm an old friend of June's, and I'm really, really honored to be here with you all, and happy to be at this event. And really respect this, these ideas and this community. So I feel very warmly towards this opportunity. And so I'm going to be reading a bit, but what I'm going to be talking about is more the kind of general context around sex worker issues and sex worker rights. Yeah, certainly when FOSTA passed, our community was extremely upset. I mean, people were advertising that was how they were surviving. And I mean, I started hearing about people actually trying to commit suicide, considering suicide. I mean, very, very serious responses. Imagine having a family to support and suddenly your income is taken away. And there was really no warning, because as soon as it was announced, the individuals started pulling the websites out of fear. So this has been an enormous trauma for so many individuals in my community. I just can't begin to tell you how scary it's been for us. In terms of I want to talk about the idea about FOSTA passing. One thing I noticed is that in legislation, whenever I hear that something is bipartisan, I get really scared. Because the first thing that the bipartisan efforts attack is sex work, drugs, and there's a few other things. So as soon as you hear that they're trying to do something bipartisan, I mean even locally, then that means they're going to all gang up on the sex workers, or all gang up on the drug users. So, there's a few categories like that, but this was just, a horrific thing and very common and very expected. And there was no warning. We saw these two different bills crawling along, and then all of a sudden they just, came to the surface and they passed it. So without much thought, not realizing how this would basically overstep the protections in Section 230. And it was kind of opening the door to a violation of that concept that the internet service providers weren't responsible for the content. And, of course, other communities can be affected by this later. This has broadest ramifications, but the, electronic
Frontier Foundation.
Yes.
are challenging it, and I think the ACLU has another kind of challenge going. There are several organizations that are working on a challenge, and I mean, I have no idea what's going to happen, but, oh no, oops. So I want to talk about the sex worker rights movement in general and just kind of give you a feeling for moving forward, and the background also that I think created the situation where we are kind of contemporary targets, right? So, I mean, I guess we all know, there's that ancient biblical whore stigma, right? The whore stigma, and in so many religions, you think, maybe it would just be in Christianity or in the Christian Bible, but there are a lot, when I talk to other, people who are Buddhists, and I talk to people from many different religions and from all over the world, and I hear that there's, that this anti-whore stigma resonates with so many religions. I don't know what that's about, and it's very scary. Then sex negativity in general. So I mean, we're all sexually abused just growing up in this culture, right? I mean, it's such an abusive culture, and part of this abuse is repression of sex work. Sex work, one of the few things that a person can do when they're poor. I mean, there's a lot of sides to sex work, but what I think it's one of the first things that you can do if you're poor to support your family. I mean, and women also, and any vulnerable group like youth, immigrants, any people in the informal economy, any kind of group like that. This is one of the few things that they can do to support themselves, and to think, that this is then one of the first targets. Sexual control is a normal kind of social control. That is the heart of much social control. So, I mean, when I try to figure out any way out of it, and I think that this is one of the most common tactics for social control, it just gives me a headache. And current laws, of course, will discourage the sex worker participation and sex worker ability to get involved in the laws, like criminalizing our communities. I don't even have to tell you this, it's on my list though. And my expertise now, because I didn't give my little intro, but I started working, in late 70s and started the massage parlors and the Tenderloin. I worked in the ads mostly. I worked in the fetish business. I had a lot of different ways I worked for many, many years. And now, maybe I really kind of haven't done it maybe for 10 years, I think. It's kind of hard to believe. I don't like to say I'm a former sex worker because that has negative connotations in some ways. It's like, oh, you gave it up, you stepped out of the life. I mean, to me, it's just like one more thing. It's not like you have to step out of the life, although some sex workers do feel like that. It's very important to remember that there's such a diversity of attitudes among sex workers. So, but this is mine. But my interest became focused on trafficking issues because, I've been through the AIDS crisis, and during the AIDS crisis, we organized to fight the laws that were proposing that they give us punitive quarantine if we're HIV positive, if we even solicit a hand job. So for soliciting with a condom. I know that's right. If you solicit a hand job with a condom, that is a felony. And you
Condoms
could
were used as evidence.
and
The condoms were used
the
as
condoms, and they use the condoms as evidence. Thank you, that's right.
Yeah.
They use the condoms as evidence. And it was punitive quarantine because if you're quarantined in prisons, it's punitive because you just don't have access to the library and to some of the things the other people had. Well, they didn't say it was punitive because, on the paper it wasn't punitive, it was just quarantine. So we fought and fought. Willie Brown proposed it, and it was some bipartisan deal to get the right and the left together on some issue, and it passed easily, and it passed in, I guess, 2/3 of the states, something like that. It was only taken off the books recently. And the main people who were targeted and imprisoned long-term were transgender people. So it was just a way to really,
Yeah, and using the condoms as evidence would further, people wouldn't carry the condoms and then more spread of disease.
Yeah, the condom,
Yeah.
if you used a condom to protect yourself against
Right.
AIDS,
Right.
then they confiscate it, and then they put you in jail for using a condom. And that
So
was
they
passed
forbid-
I'm not sure
God, that was in the
when that
90s,
was passed.
It was in the
But it
90s.
wasn't passed, it was just like something the DA started doing as a way to get more evidence. I don't even know if they do it anymore. I don't think they don't do it anymore. They go into massage parlors, they have raids. I mean, from what I hear, they certainly could, use that in combination. So it's a constant fight to get them not to do that. But as I've been through that, trafficking really meant a lot to me. I realized that the framework and the idea of trafficking was going to impact us in even a more negative way, because I understood historically that trafficking meant prostitution, and there had been laws and cyclical campaigns against trafficking for so long. In the early 1900s, it started in the late 1800s, and it was really only about prostitution. So as soon as the anti-trafficking laws were developed, we realized that the targets were going to be sex workers. And our allies, there were two anti-trafficking movements. There's an anti-prostitution, anti-trafficking movement that really wants to push this kind of agenda. And then there's an anti-trafficking movement that calls themselves rights-based, that includes harm reduction activists, and talks about changing the agenda. They say that it's about trafficking of labor in general. They're changing it from prostitution. It's not about prostitution anymore. But the sex workers didn't really like that, because we know historically the targets are sex workers. So if you say anti-trafficking, 3/4 of the population are thinking anti-prostitution. And then a great number of the laws against trafficking are anti-prostitution, and FOSTA-SESTA is just the best example of how that the anti-trafficking framework really targets sex workers. And in the movement now, it's a very difficult philosophical construct at all, because to think about this framework and to then say, well, the framework is problematic because of the historical issues, and then to say, well, of course we don't want people forced, but the framework of trafficking, which lumps disparate groups together, homeless people, people working in factories, youth on the street who may be just doing survival sex, lumping all those people together who are in extremely disparate situations. And then they say, we care about those people, and then their solution is to arrest the sex workers. Of course, the anti-immigrant aspect of anti-trafficking is right at the forefront. So just now, I have just a 1.5-minute video of the deconstructing. This is just kind of a feminist Catherine McKinnon short piece that encapsulates her basis for being anti-prostitution. I think you might need to put that volume up a little bit.
Sex, when it's right, like friendship, is its own reward. It's mutual. It's equal in its diversity. You can't buy the real thing. In prostitution, women have sex with men they would never otherwise have sex with. The money thus acts as a form of force, not as a measure of consent. It acts like physical force does in rape. And as Kathleen Barry put it, the only difference between rape and prostitution is time. One ends.
So I think that's very interesting, and I know. I think this is really kind of the quintessential element, the quintessential objection to prostitution in my mind. I think that the point here is that sex should only happen a specific way. And I think this belief system about sex is like a religion, fundamentalist feminism, they call it. So I think that this is how I need to look at it just to stay sane. I mean, I think that basically, my feeling is that they have an idea about sex. You certainly should only do it either with love or it used to be marriage, now you can do it with love. But the idea about doing it for money is just, they feel like it's obviously totally bad. Sex should not be done for money. Sex all has to be done with love or even attraction. So I think we all need to examine what we believe and how we feel about that. I think that's really embedded in all our attitudes, and there's a lot for me always to deconstruct, because it's something we grow up with, and I find it fascinating. And just to think of how you feel like sex can best be in your lives, and how other people have the right to experience sex in the ways they want to. But I just feel like this is like the quintessential issue. Now I want to look here at the timing, because I have something and I like to read.
6 minutes.
What?
6 minutes.
Okay, I'm going to read this, and I'm going to try to read it with lots of expression, because it's a little bit long, okay? But I really love this, and it's
You
from...
need to take a little extra time.
Oh, no, it's perfect. No, it's just a long piece to read. Well, it's just like a paragraph. But this is from 1997, Calcutta, a manifesto for sex workers' rights, and it talks about stigma. And the reason I really embrace it is because I don't want to, I want to avoid the kind of trap as a first world or, not developing nation person thinking about my rights. And, when there's so many issues for people in poverty, and, I want to emphasize again that sex work happens in poverty. It happens middle-class people trying to make a little more money. It can happen with people who are wealthier trying to experiment, or anybody trying to experiment, artists. That was me doing my art and support. The diversity of experiences is the key. But at the same time, the link between poverty and prostitution has not really been explored properly. It's not explored by the anti-prostitution people who just use it as a battering ram against us, and it's not explored by the sex workers' rights movement, as we are always so defensive about the whole situation. So I don't even think we begin to know the link between prostitution and poverty, the link between poverty and all kinds of contexts of survival and drugs and violence and all that. So I think blah, blah. Okay. The term prostitute is rarely used to refer to an occupational group who earn their livelihood through providing sexual services. Rather, it is deployed as a descriptive term denoting a homogenized category, usually of women, who poses a threat to public health, sexual morality, social stability, and civic order. Within this discursive boundary, we systematically find ourselves to be the targets of moralizing impulses of dominant social groups through missions of cleansing and sanitizing, both materially and symbolically. Charity organizations are prone to rescue us and put us in safe homes. Developmental organizations are likely to rehabilitate us through meager income-generating activities. As powerless, abused victims with no resources, we are seen as objects of pity. Otherwise, we appear as self-sacrificing and nurturing supportive cast of characters in popular literature and cinema. Oh, this is Indian, by the way. Ceaselessly ready to give up our hard-earned income, our clients, our sinful ways, and finally our lives to ensure the well-being of the hero or the society he represents. In either case, we were refused enfranchisement as legitimate citizens or workers and are banished to the margins of society and history. Just to close, I want to say from Coyote, Margot St. James, and Priscilla Alexander tells us the right to be a prostitute is as important as the right not to be one. To set the terms of one's own sexuality, plus the right to earn a good living. And I think that I have done it. Thank you so much.
Oh, Starchild, stand up here as well. Great. Stretch a little bit. It's an honor and privilege to follow Carol Leight because she has been doing this work for so long and really dedicated single issue person. We need our single issue activists. I'm coming from much more of a place of being an across the board freedom activist, although sex work obviously is near and dear to my heart, being a companion erotic service provider myself. But it's really the old saying, may you live in interesting times, being a curse. I think we do live in really interesting times right now, and there's so much threat to sex work among other freedoms, but there's also such great opportunity, I think, because things are really in flux and changing very rapidly, and the political paradigms are shifting around in weird ways. It's like, well, even 5 years ago, who would have thought that so many of the Republicans would be, anti-trade, or that so many on the left would be anti-free speech. There's interesting combinations forming. And I've been involved, like I said in the introduction, primarily, with the Libertarian Party has been a major vehicle for my activism, because libertarians are really kind of like a secular, political version of Thelema in some sense. How many of you have heard of the non-aggression principle? It's basically the idea that each individual has the right to do as they wish, so long as they do not initiate force or fraud against others. And this principle goes way back and appears in different forms. And I would say that even some of what Aleister Crowley was talking about was a different formulation of the non-aggression principle, as is the concept of ahimsa in India in the Jain tradition, has a lot of similarity. Even the golden rule, do unto others as you would have others do unto you. There's an implicit recognition there of the rights of others as well as the rights of oneself. And the Libertarian Party, indeed the whole libertarian movement, really is, I would say, and some libertarians self-identified would disagree with me on this, but I think it's the heart and soul of our movement. It's really the foundation on which the whole thing rests. And so that manifests itself obviously in a lot of different ways. Libertarians oppose any, and we tend to focus on the state, by which we mean governments, those who use the power of the law to enact these kinds of controls on, and limitations on what people can do. We don't usually explicitly say, we have the right to kill people who will interfere with our rights, but we do strongly stand for the right to self-defense, which has also come under major threat and attack recently. The right to keep and bear arms is not terribly popular, especially liberal places here like the Bay Area, where maybe progressive is a better word than liberal these days. It's funny, libertarian was actually originally a left-wing anarchist term, whereas the term liberal was more of originally a libertarian term. And the left kind of took the term liberal, and some libertarians don't call themselves classical liberals to sort of, still have a claim on that word, and are upset about the left kind of taking that word. But then some of the left are upset about us kind of taking the word libertarian. So it's been an interesting, again, kind of paradigm shift there. But for libertarians, in this country anyway, we've been, pro decriminalization of sex work since, even before the beginning of the Libertarian Party itself in 1971. It's always been part of what we stood for, but it hasn't, I would say, really been a front burner issue for us. Things have been sort of the front burner issues. Taxes, getting government to stop initiating force by taking people's money without their consent. And notice all these things hinge on consent. As I like to say recently in the rise of the Me Too movement, consent. It's not just about sex anymore. It's anything that you are doing or involved with should be done on the basis of consent. If you want to give your money for a good cause, that should be consensual. It shouldn't be the government taking the money from you by force. But anyway, for money, guns, taxes, sound money. Getting back to a system that doesn't inflate the money and having government right now printing paper money based on nothing of any real value. It is decreasing the value of each dollar that we have in our pockets. And since 1913, when the Federal Reserve was created, the value of the dollar has gone down by something like 98%. So they're worth like $2 of 2% of what it was in real value after adjusting for inflation. So those have been some of the main issues. But recently, with some of the things that have been going on, and FOSTA-SESTA being just kind of the latest, before that there was a targeting the site Rent Boy a few years ago was shut down by the Department of Homeland Security. And I was like, what does Homeland Security have to do with sex work or even with trafficking? It's supposed to be about like fighting terrorism and stuff, right? They find really circuitous reasoning like, oh, this is involved in funding terrorism, or laundering money, or who knows. But that was shut down. The women's site, Red Book, was shut down. There have been prosecutions even before Backpage was raided by the FBI. A number of state attorneys general were going after Backpage. There's things like Prop 35 in California a few years ago that further criminalized sex work and made it so that, for example, even someone, like driving their roommate to a session who's a sex worker or whatever could be potentially prosecuted as trafficking them, this sort of thing. It's been coming more to the notice of libertarians, and this year at our national convention, which happens every 2 years, we managed to put an explicit plank in the platform. I think there used to be something more explicit. Our platform was kind of gutted in 2006. I won't get into all the details of that, but there were people that thought, oh, there's too much stuff in here. We want to just boil it down and have just a bunch of general statements instead of being too specific with things that might rub certain people the wrong way. We'll just keep it very sort of broad and vague. And radicals in the party like myself are not happy about that. We've been sort of trying to fight to get back some of the more specific detail. So this year we did get a sex work rights plank. And I always refer to sex work rights, by the way, rather than sex worker. I'll talk more about this later. If you want to pull up lp.org/platform, if you have the thing there, let's see, show you exactly what it says. lp.org/platform.
Sometimes it takes a while.
Anyway, going back there, there's been a number of people in the party who've been working not just for this, but for sex work to take a higher profile in our movement generally.
Here we go. Got it. Where do you want it?
So when you scroll down under personal liberty here, you will find, keep going. Oops.
Crime and justice.
Actually, I think it might be under, keep going down. Is it under?
Sex work.
Separate.
There we go. The Libertarian Party supports the decriminalization of prostitution. We assert the right of consenting adults to provide sexual services to clients for compensation and the right of clients to purchase sexual services from consenting sex workers. I actually wrote that language. It didn't originally say, it originally said consenting persons. That got changed to consenting adults, which, unfortunately government defines who an adult is, and that's part of the problem there. But it's still pretty good wording, and we were really happy with that. But there's been a number of people that have been really instrumental in moving the issue to a higher profile in the party. The chair of the Hawaii Party, Tracy Bryan, who's a transgender woman, has been doing great work there, lobbying at state level for decriminalization. Here in California, we've had Norma Jean Almodovar, who wrote a terrific and very funny book, which I'll read, called "From Cop to Call Girl." She started out working as a LAPD officer in the 1980s, and kind of got disillusioned with that and quit and became a high-priced call girl, and subsequently targeted by the LAPD and had all kinds of travails with that. But she ran for lieutenant governor in California as libertarian in 1996, I believe it was. You've also had, there's a woman named Maggie McNeil, who's based out of Seattle, who does terrific writing at a blog called The Honest Courtesan. She's spoken at a number of our conventions. We've had in New Hampshire, which, how many have heard of the Free State Project? This is a concept to get to critical mass of libertarians in one small state, so we can at least in one place. And they've had quite a lot of success. There's actually
What state? What state?
New Hampshire.
Oh, New Hampshire?
Yeah. Yeah, the motto of New Hampshire is "Live free or die." They're the only, there's a number of things that are great about New Hampshire. No state income tax, no mandatory seatbelt or helmet laws, full right to keep and bear arms, gay marriage is legal, et cetera, et cetera. So there's been a number of positive things there, and they have. This is no coincidence. They have one of the largest legislatures in the world, and combined with low state population, that means that there's relatively few constituents per legislator, so you can pretty easily talk to your representatives. When they were debating the gay marriage bill there a few years ago, I personally called a number of state legislators and was actually able to talk to some of them personally. They answered their own phones. It's just like unheard of. You try to call the Capitol in California. Each of them has like hundreds of thousands of constituents they don't have for you. But so we've had a bill introduced there in New Hampshire to try to decriminalize prostitution at the state level. So there's like 3 libertarians in the state legislature, 2 former Republicans and a former Democrat. And so I think things are moving along, and not just in the party. I mean, the bad news is that there's kind of an unholy alliance, I call it, has been developed between the feminist left, people like Catherine McKinnon, who Carol Leight was showing the video of. And, and then on the right, the people, the traditional, sort of conservative Christian moralists. But the conservative Christian moralists have figured out they can't really, run anymore against a campaign against prostitution on the basis of saying, oh, you're sinful, you're fallen women, all this kind of thing. That old sort of shaming thing doesn't really work anymore. The public's not buying that. So they've kind of switched over this narrative about trafficking, and that we have to save and protect these people from our evil, they call them pimps or traffickers or exploiters or whatever. And the truth is that most of my clients are wonderful people. They're ordinary people. They come from all different walks of life, mostly men, but some couples, some women. And the female clients, by the way, are pretty much invisible in the narrative of the antis, as are male sex workers like myself, or even transgender sex workers. To them, it's all about evil exploiting males and helpless, victimized females who are being oppressed by them. And but so these two sides have kind of come together, and I think lobbied effectively to get things like FOSTA passed at the national level. But the good news is they don't have very deep public support. A lot of the support is just based on sort of this fear-mongering about trafficking, which unfortunately the media, their sensationalism kind of bought into and helped perpetuate and spread. But when people learn the truth, they I think are pretty receptive and understanding of the fact that this is just being used by government to have an excuse to spend more money and go after people, and it's being used by these crusaders to conflate consensual sex, which a lot of people today don't really have a lot of problem with that. With coercive trafficking, which pretty much everybody, including the sex work community, is against. So the public opposition is not very deep, but the public support isn't very deep either, unfortunately. And this is where we have a lot of work to do as a movement. And unfortunately, there's a lot of infighting within the movement. It tends to be mostly sex workers and former sex workers. We don't have a lot of participation or support by our clients or the general public involved in the movement itself, in the activism. So how much time do I have, by the way, Mike?
You have 8 minutes.
Okay. So this is one of the reasons I think it's so important to talk about this as a sex work rights movement, because clients are very much victimized and oppressed too. They may not have their livelihoods at stake in the same way that sex workers do, but if anything, I think they're actually more stigmatized than we are. I think it is more of a stigma, and they are more demonized today in the culture than sex workers are. And I think sex workers have often been kind of slow to recognize and acknowledge this and really incorporate clients into the movement as equals. There's been a tendency to want to sort of see them as allies, and this term allies kind of gets used by a lot on the left to sort of mean people in a secondary status. Like, okay, you're here to help, and we appreciate that, but it's not about you, it's about us, and you have to listen to us and kind of sit down and shut up when we tell you to, so it's not always that harsh, but that's kind of the undercurrent, the unspoken message a lot of times, that it really needs to be focused on. I mean, in the sex work rights movement, they're saying nothing about us without us, but by the us, they typically mean sex workers, not clients or other people who are affected or involved with this. And for every one sex worker, I've estimated, there's got to be at least 10 clients out there, and that's probably conservative. And a lot of them have more money than we do. They're really the bulk of our potential movement and support. People who are being victimized and who are being stigmatized and criminalized and don't feel like they have a lot of voice right now. They haven't gotten the recognition from inside the movement, and they're getting all this pressure from outside the movement. Usually when clients are arrested or targeted, they just want to make it go away because of the public stigma. They don't want to be shamed publicly. They don't want to be embarrassed by their partners. In a lot of cases, the pressure against prostitution comes from spouses, typically women, of men who are going to see sex workers. Right here in Oakland, by the way, how many of you live in Oakland? How many of you know who Abel Gillian, and I don't know if I'm saying his name right, Gillian is? He's a member of the city council, but earlier this year, he introduced legislation to enable the Oakland Police Department to seize the cars of people who are merely suspected of looking for liaisons of sex workers. And he's up for election, by the way, in November. So if you're voting, you might think about that. And maybe call his office, let him know, hey, this is why I'm not voting for you. You know?
Are you in Oakland?
No, I actually live in San Francisco.
Oh, you are?
But try to keep an eye on
Yeah.
other stuff going on in the area, this sort of thing. Where was I?
Oakland politician.
Before that.
Victimizing
Oh,
clients.
just yeah. So I think
You have 5 minutes.
part of the work that I think we have to really try to do is really open our doors. We struggle with this at a local level. SWAP, Sex Workers Outreach Project, was Carol Leight mentioned, and I've also been involved with since that was founded. It was actually originally an Australian group, and then Robin Few here in the Bay Area started it in the United States, and it expanded to become a national organization. But she started right here in San Francisco, Oakland, and unfortunately she died of cancer a few years ago. She was a really great leader, and we've had sort of iterations after that, but it's sort of fallen apart recently. We don't have a current sort of activist group, besides perhaps the U.S. Prostitutes Collective. That's primarily Rachel Wooten. It's not a very big or sort of inclusive group in some ways either. There's really a need for that, I think, and I hope to perhaps at some point see that arise again soon. I do, as was mentioned in the intro, run this group on Meetup, meetup.com/decriminalize, which is basically just there at this point to kind of to promote other events, things like this one I posted on there. But we don't have regular local meetings. So if anybody's interested in that sort of direct activism, let me know afterwards. And also pass out these flyers, which is not directly about sex work per se, but it's about freedom. Anybody who wants to be activist for any kind of freedom at the local level. And it can't even actually be a national or a global issue like immigration or the war on drugs or something, as long as you're involved in activism at the local level to try to do something about it. So it's a new monthly event I've started, and our second event is tomorrow actually. It's in the city, but you don't have to live in the city to come if you're interested. My hope is to bring a lot of people together and get a lot of different caucuses started, people who want to talk about different freedoms. And so my hope is that there will be a sex work rights caucus that's maybe growing out of that to do some local activism. But yeah, we really need to get our message more to the public. I mean, something like FOSTA-SESTA would not have happened if we'd had more of a grassroots base that was already mobilized and engaged.
More of a fight.
Yeah, they were able to pass it far too easily.
Yeah.
And there were some sex workers. There's actually, if you want to pull up reason.tv.
Reason.tv?
But TV.
Oh, Reason.
So maybe you heard of Reason Foundation or Reason Magazine? Nobody really. Wow.
Yeah.
Okay. This is my favorite publication. These guys are great, very supportive of sex work rights and freedom in general.
So what about
Reason.tv. Oh, and then search JINX. There were some sex workers who went to Washington and did this version right here. If you want to click on that. So did some lobbying on this issue. I love that graphic. If you just want to play the video here, this is just a little short thing. So they talk about going and actually getting a pretty
we are
positive
going to fight. We're going to stand strong for what we believe in, each other.
Last month, the corridors of power in Washington opened up to the world's oldest profession. 40 sex workers met with 30 members of Congress to push back against the Fight Online Sex Trafficking Act. Why would professional lawmakers meet with professional lawbreakers? Reason tagged along to find out why.
So what we're doing right now is super exciting because as far as we know, there has never been a sex worker lobby day on the Hill, but there is today.
We're going to be going to our representatives, talking with them. A lot of them aren't super familiar with sex worker rights.
Particularly in the wake of SESTA and how SESTA has impacted us.
SESTA is a bill that passed recently that heavily restricts and criminalizes advertising for sex work on the internet.
The Stop Enabling Sex Traffickers Act, or SESTA, would allow sex trafficking victims to have their day in court by eliminating federal liability protections for technology providers that knowingly facilitate online sex trafficking.
Today, when the House votes on FOSTA, we will be sending a clear message. Businesses that sell human beings online can no longer do so with impunity.
FOSTA stands for Fighting Online Sex Trafficking Act. It is a law that purports to fight minors being forced into sex work. And it purports to do it by increasing liability for online intermediaries.
The bill also provides increased criminal liability and thus deters websites and individuals from selling human beings online. Websites will no longer be able to turn a blind eye or actively conceal this horrific practice without facing very real consequences.
The federal government says if you're an online platform, you generally are not liable for what goes on by users on your site. FOSTA and SESTA before that are the first steps toward enforcing more liability, allegedly to go after sex traffickers. We're really fooling around in an odd way that you don't expect. We're fooling around with one of the legal foundations of the internet that's been really so successful, particularly with social media.
Craigslist and Reddit have already shuttered sections of their website, citing FOSTA liability concerns. Facebook and other large technology companies have backed the legislation, while a trade group representing startups has opposed it.
Thank you very much for being with us today as we sign this crucial legislation to combat online sex trafficking and bring criminals to justice.
Signing the bill was very much in character for President Trump. It's a bill in which it appeals to people's gut instincts about things. It doesn't ask questions about, are we going about this in the right way? What are the costs? What are the all of those issues. Populists don't ask those questions.
O.T.O Institute, by the way.
The only surprising thing is he didn't support it more strongly, and I think that's probably because he himself has legal and deep political issues connected to various kinds of sexual issues, let's say.
Today, Carl Ferrer, the CEO of Backpage.com, the man behind what authorities are calling the world's top online brothel, facing criminal charges for the very first time.
The purpose of government is not to make people into better people morally. If government's role is to enforce a majority or a minority's view, you're going to be coercing people who are pursuing their idea of what the good life is.
To even discuss sex work is something that we weren't sure what the response would be for that.
Sure.
And that is the problem that we're trying to overcome here right now, is the lack of communication, because we've found that most people don't even know what FOSTA and SESTA are/were, and that they were very effectively manipulated, essentially, into believing that it was truly an anti-trafficking law, when in reality it is hurting survivors of trafficking and it's really hurting sex workers.
Sex workers often advertise on the internet as a way to screen clients. And this is a huge help in keeping people safe. If you don't have the ability to check on someone's criminal record, for example, before you meet up with them, you don't know if they could be violent or not. And because FOSTA limits in a lot of ways the ways I am able to advertise and run my business, it makes it more dangerous for me.
The Department of Justice had sent over a letter, very last minute, kind of speaking to the, I don't know if I call it ad hoc, but the fast-moving nature of the bill, that they obviously weren't even consulted before it was brought to the floor.
Yeah.
And even DOJ was saying that they questioned highly
the Vox article has a link to that
We live in
letter.
a system where the process is supposed to be deliberative, it's supposed to be fairly slow, you're supposed to have committee work, it's supposed to be informed and detailed. The original law had many problems, and there was a lot of informed criticism of it, and Congress on the House side was responding, but then suddenly it was pulled out of committee on the House side, brought to the floor for a vote, and passed and then signed by President Trump. Once it got out of that and got defined as, are you for or against coercively forcing children to engage in sex? You know, that was the definition, and no one was going to vote for that.
These are tough bills because you look at the titles of them, you look at what people say that they do, and it's
It's a setup, because then it's gonna be an election year, and it's like, well, this person voted for child slavery. He was great.
Tara's found a meeting that goes better than that.
Yeah, he's not with us for an hour. I don't often leave a building feeling hopeful for my government.
Exactly, yeah, being like, wow, I really feel like I'm being represented by my elected officials.
Over 30 more congressional representatives would open their doors to Jinx and other sex worker activists that day. And by the end of the month, the Electronic Frontier Foundation joined Human Rights Watch and the Woodhull Freedom Foundation in a lawsuit challenging FOSTA in federal court.
I'm not saying I'm happy with Washington, D.C. I'm not saying I'm happy with the politicians. I'm glad they did the thing that they are supposed to do, which is represent us. So you can't bring down the whole system overnight. We can't decriminalize sex work overnight either. But as we continue to have dialogue with our representatives, perhaps we can shift it a little bit closer to the kind of government that we say we have.
It went a little longer than 5 minutes.
Well, that was extremely apropos. That was perfect.
Oh, good. Yeah. So, yeah, I'll just close on something else I was thinking I should have maybe said in my written intro, which is that I'm a survivor of trafficking. However, I wasn't trafficked by the kind of people this legislation was going after. I was trafficked by the Fremont Police Department. I was lured to Fremont by a client, some woman purporting to be a client who turned out to be a cop. And they set me up, manipulated me into saying something they thought was enough evidence to arrest me. And then a bunch of male cops rushed in from the next room and arrested me and took me to Fremont jail. Then they took me to the San Ramon jail, 24 hours in custody or so. Let me out in the middle of the night, which is just something that they're finally is being addressed actually in California, is the practice by a lot of jails of letting people, out in the middle of the night when they're released, no money, no transportation, whatever. I had to bum money to get on BART just to get back to the city because they hadn't returned my property yet. And so anyway, that was my brief experience with being trafficked. So sometimes you can kind of turn around the language and use it against those who want to oppress us and violate our rights. So I always like to make a point of saying that. But anyway, I'll let our third panelist here take over. And thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And now finally, Miriam.
Yeah, and I'm going to be the odd person out and sit, or as I like to say, queers have the right to sit as they will. So there are a few things that I'm going to try to tackle in the brief time that we have available. And before I do that, I just want to say how overwhelmingly thrilled I am to be sitting with these lovely co-panelists, and particularly Carol Leight, who you don't have any idea how much my inner 20-year-old is freaking out right now. Because when I cut my teeth on sex-positive feminist theory, including your work and Annie Sprinkle and Carol Queen and so many others, it really started a path of sex-positive liberty that's led to really inform everything I do today. So I'm glad I didn't know you were going to be on the panel sooner, or I would have been too intimidated to come. So there we go. I got that out of the way, and I'm still speaking in sentences. Okay. So there are a couple of different dimensions that I want to touch on. One is going to be how sex work really does tie into the path of magic, going well back millennia. I want to talk a little bit about the aspect of sex work itself, and particularly how SESTA and FOSTA have endangered what should be one's birthright of work and loving as one will. But then I also want to talk, and somewhat personally, about the collateral damage I've seen in a number of sex-positive communities and the wider realm of sex education. As Michael mentioned earlier, I like to joke that I'm an accidental sex educator. I've been a lifelong Thelemite. I've been studying Thelema actively since 1994. I've been a member of Ordo Templi Orientis since 2006 and an affiliate since well before then. And also relevant is that I have a degree in religious studies, and I happened to do my early work on popular religious culture in the pre-exilic Judah and the ancient Near East. That was the core of my work. So I do want to quickly get back to Carol's question of why is it that we see these prohibitions against sex work throughout the majority of modern religion, excluding new religious movements like Thelema and a great deal of the rest of paganism. And my work really indicated that the popular religious culture of pre-exilic Judah, very similarly to Babylon, to Persia, to Sumer, included the practice of sexual rites, and particularly included sacred prostitution. So Samuel Noah Kramer is a good resource on this from the Sumerian perspective. But interestingly, the Hebrew Bible itself is a particularly good source on what was really happening on the ground. As terrible as it is to read, the entire book of Jeremiah talks a great deal about sacred prostitution happening under every leafy green tree from these priestesses who are baking cakes to the Queen of Heaven, and oh my God, God's going to strike you down. Getting back to the role of clients and prostitutes, very famously, the story of Tamar and Judah. Tamar is being screwed over for her rights as a widow and is being denied levirate marriage, and she manages to dress herself as a sacred whore and wait under the leafy green trees and finds her father-in-law, Judah, who sleeps with her, and when he can't pay, she keeps his sacred staff. She later uses this to prove her rights to levirate marriage to the courts. When I think of Tamar, and I think of everything she had at stake, literally without the rights to levirate marriage, her child was endangered, her life was endangered. She managed to get Judah sort of over a barrel by taking his sign of power and threatening to embarrass him. And while I can understand what you're saying about parity between clients and sex workers, I'm also inclined to paraphrase Margaret Atwood and say that clients are afraid that people will embarrass them, and sex workers are afraid that people will kill them. And there is a risk and skin in the game that clients have, that sex workers are literally dying. And that goes back to ancient times. So getting back to Carol's question, why do all of these religions prohibit sex work? I think there was a very real challenge of polytheistic popular religious practice to emergent powers, going back to the emergence of the Jewish identity while in exile in Babylon. And what happens is you've got a group of elites who are coming back and trying to assert power for the first time as a majority monotheistic construct. And of course, everything associated with the old times becomes prohibited. sacred prostitution in particular, had a path toward direct power, whether that's religious power, economic power, social power. And something that's very real about sex work, whether we're talking about ancient times or today, is that it's disintermediated. And what I mean by that is that sex workers themselves have a thing of value that cannot be taken, right? We don't need to go through an intermediary to acquire the thing of value. We don't need to go through a middleman. Doing sex work is its own value, and that is dangerous to the powers that be. If you are trying to disenfranchise an entire group of people, whether that's women or trans people, people of color, all immigrants, all of the groups that Carol's been talking about and that Starchild's been talking about as already marginalized and simply trying to make an economic stability in their lives, going after anything of inherent value is going to create barriers toward that path. If you can't regulate it, you make it illegal. And clearly this goes with a great number of other libertarian issues. So sort of going off of that, I really want to get to this idea of, first and foremost, the thing that comes to mind when we tie sex work back to Thelema, and we tie sex work back to the principles of liberties in particular. You know, it's very striking to say man has the right to work as he will. Man has the right to love as he will. Those are very obvious. We should have the right inherently to sell things of value, including but not limited to information, sex, entheogens. This should not be controversial. And yet, certain categories are traditionally used to disempower and disenfranchise entire groups. For women and trans folk, that is most often sex work. It's an easy target. For people of color, I cannot recommend strongly enough the new Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander, which really tracks how drug criminalization has been tied to an attempt to reinforce Jim Crow laws and an attempt to keep an entire category of persons essentially enslaved. If you're not already really angry, reading that book will make you angry. I don't say this to put these things on par at a parallel, but I do want to draw attention to systemic inequalities in our culture that look for, as Carol said, the easy targets of how to disenfranchise the rights of entire groups of people that are a challenge to the powers that be, right? I don't think we need to be tinfoil hat conspiracy theorists to recognize that the 1% is very interested in keeping their hold on economy, culture, means of production, and autonomy. But the other thing that I can speak to more directly as a kink educator, a venue owner, somebody that hosts sex and BDSM parties, somebody who works in kink and BDSM and polyamory and queer education, the idea that people have the right to think and speak and write as we will is also being directly impacted. And of course, that's entirely predictable. whether it's the Electronic Frontier Foundation, whether it's the advocacy works of people like Susie Q. James, whether it's the work of a wide number of people who came out actively against SESTA and FOSTA, the chilling effect on free speech is completely predictable and completely evident. Rule 230 was designed to not specifically protect sex workers, although it did so incidentally, but to protect the very foundations of the internet, to protect the very foundations of our ability to speak clearly, advocate clearly, educate clearly, whether that is the direct impacts, and my heart breaks for the people I know who are sex workers who have lost their ability to vet clients. My heart breaks for the people that I know who are directly impacted who have become literally unsafe. My heart particularly breaks for the folks that are already intersectionally marginalized, who are trans, women, people of color, all on top of one another, have limited access to economic security, and are now facing some of the only livelihood they have. And I know more than my fair share based on sort of where I work. But the impact is not limited to the people who are supposedly targeted by or helped by. Oh God, they're helping us from trafficking, bless their hearts. You know, the impact is widespread. I myself host a podcast on kink and BDSM issues and sex positive issues broadly. I write an advice column for kinky people. I teach Kink 101 classes that we have started to record and put out in the world. I do a lot of LGBTQ advocacy. And a great deal of my creative work, in addition to running my Safe Space Cafe, is hosted by a platform called Patreon, which is designed for content creators to be able to get their work out. And to their credit, Patreon hosts a lot of adult content. They are very good about trying to protect the people who have been on their platform. They take some steps that already make our content very difficult to reach. If you don't know the exact URL of the content provider you want, you can't search for them. So nobody who's under 18 is going to accidentally find this stuff. You have to know what you're looking for. And there were a lot of those requirements that were already in place to play nicely with sensitive credit card providers. My content is strictly educational. I don't do erotica. I don't do anything adult. We don't show boobies. Hey, you gotta say that sometimes. Some people on Patreon show boobies. I don't. You don't want to see my boobies. Anyway, in August, myself and a number of other content creators woke up to find that none of our payments were going through. To their credit, Patreon had preemptively, trying to protect adult content creators from SESTA FOSTA, moved all of their card processing to the UK. Ooh. Great move. Yeah, that was the good part. Yeah. The unfortunate part was that all of my 970 subscribers started waking up to fraud alerts from their banks saying that, why are you making charges in the UK? And I'm now going into my third month, and some of my subscribers are still going through this every single month with their credit card providers. So here I am trying to provide a critical lifeline to kinky people and poly people and queer people throughout the nation, particularly in places that are not San Francisco and are not blessed with kink education. You know, I'm trying to pay it forward and get those queer kids the resources that knowing that the Carol Leighs and Annie Sprinkles of the world existed did for me, 30 years ago. And suddenly I can't do that. And that's terrifying. Not being able to provide education is one of the entirely predictable and supposedly unwanted side effects of SESTA-FOSTA. I have to believe, knowing everything I do about working in the adult industry, that this side effect was not only entirely predictable, but it's not a bug, it's a feature. People have been trying to shut down discourse about sex work and about sex forever. And, you know, I find it notable that this panel is one day after the leak of documents that are circulating in the Department of Health and Human Services to essentially make it impossible to get recognition as a trans person without resorting to one's gender as assigned at birth on a birth certificate. If you're not already aware of this, and I invite you to go check the news, I already am hearing news of trans people taking their lives just in the last 2 days, specifically related to this work. Criminalizing any and all sexual behavior that does not serve the powers that be has always been the point of US sex laws, right? We are only 60-some years beyond interracial marriage being illegal in much of the country. We are only 10 years into gay marriage being legal in San Francisco. I can't tell you how many of my friends are currently celebrating their 10th wedding anniversaries. We are, you know, less than 70 years past homosexuality being illegal in the majority of the country. We are only 40-some years past Stonewall. Being a sexual being, for most of us who deviate outside the norms, remains illegal. Polyamory can lose you your kids, your house, your livelihood. And I again have to circle back to who benefits and who loses. While there is definitely a stigma against clients, and while I would love to see clients recognized and taking a step up in the movement, I think the biggest barrier is the fact that clients usually get away with a slap on the hand, and sex workers lose their entire livelihood. That's an economic injustice that remains partially because clients often come from positions of power and privilege, and are not used to being held accountable for illegal behaviors. I think we can see that all the way up in our government right now. So, you know, I just want to recognize that if you don't think you are personally impacted by the criminalization of sex work, the reason I'm bringing up all of these issues that may seem peripheral is that they are in fact all interrelated. The exact same process that leads to sex work being criminalized is the same process that leads to gay marriage being criminalized, that leads to gay sex being criminalized, that leads to polyamory being criminalized, that leads to it being apparently legislating out of existence the entire category of transgender. We're on a very backwards path with regard to sexuality in this country, and every time we start making progress, there is an equal and opposite reaction to try to recriminalize individuals and assert power over our own individual liberties and birthrights. And as Thelemites, and as people who believe in the ability to work as you will, to love as you will, to speak and think and write as you will, I believe it's incumbent upon us to fight for these rights with everything we have, and to build those alliances and find common cause to treat this all as one larger issue of sexual and economic liberty. And I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. Well, again, I want to thank our three very articulate panelists for clarifying these issues. We have time for questions.
Next minutes.
So now, as I hoped and planned, we have a little extra time that we can field some questions or comments from anybody who wants to. Yes.
So I have just a couple questions. So I noticed y'all titled the talk "The Decriminalization of Sex Work" in Thelema. Is there a reason why y'all went with the word decriminalization as opposed to legalization of sex work?
They're all looking at me. I'm the one who titled it.
Okay. So it was just
Actually, yeah. June, would you like to speak to this? Because you're the one who got on my case about it years ago.
Yeah. Okay, so
Right.
this is my boyfriend right here, and I used to be a sex worker, and so legalization, well, usually that means somebody's going to intervene and take your money and stuff.
Or force you to get licensing.
Be right, and all that other stuff.
Right.
And decriminalization is basically just keep the laws off of us, just let us be and let us, take charge of our own bodies. Don't put your laws on my bodies. It's an old slogan, we used to put it up on our signs, and it's basically that is it. It just like, get the fuck off me.
As I remember you put it, if sex work is legalized, then the state becomes the pen.
Right, and already, even with it being illegal, it still is the pimp, because they make money off of sending men to John's school, and yeah, so and then there's cops that go in and they take down the massage parlor and raid their cash register, and just horrible things. And also they pay for an escorting license. You pay $2,000 to the city. It used to be a long time ago. I don't remember, and you still can get busted. It's basically they're still making money off your ass. Whether it's legal or illegal. So it's just kind of decriminalize it. Get away from me. Just stay off me. Yeah. Basically, that's why.
And I know that one more thing, and then I'll let Sarah talk. I noticed one of the people speaking, I think one of the videos, they said, they're selling people online. I think it was one of the senators.
Selling people.
Right. That's like, they're not. Sex workers are selling a service. They're not selling themselves. They're not even renting themselves. It's time and a service, and it is an intimacy, and not a lot of people would want to do that. Granted, then don't do it. So we are definitely not in favor of anybody being forced or coerced or otherwise doing that kind of work. If they would prefer not to, and then that gets into poverty issues. Right. Actually, I'll see if I can find it in a minute. But Aleister Crowley talks about this in his comments on the Book of the Law about coercion should not be an aspect of sexuality. I'll see if I can find that. But it's this mischaracterization of anyone who does sex work for money necessarily selling themselves. It's like, well, wait a minute. So when I was a file clerk and bored out of my mind, in a cubicle 8 hours a day, I wasn't selling myself. Sometimes that's
I think
Well, yeah,
athletes really
and
sell
athletes.
Yeah, athletes.
You don't sell your body, you
Their
sell your
bo-
time.
Their bodies are
Insuring that stuff for
Yeah.
lots of money too.
Right,
Yeah.
right. And then, so anyway, we go on and on about that. But Starchild, yes.
To go back to your question, most of the people most of the activists in the movement have deliberately chosen the word decriminalization over legalization. Even though I think legalization ultimately would be the ideal for all of us if it was really done in a way that kept government off people's backs. The problem is that right now, anytime something like this gets legalized, that's not going to be the case. So that's why we've gone with decriminalization. Like jaywalking, for example, is largely decriminalized. You see people jaywalk right in front of a cop and nothing happens. Riding a bicycle on the sidewalk, largely decriminalized. Although I did get a ticket for it before, but so that's why and most sex workers and advocates have been pretty good about recognizing this is why we've gone with this term. There's also a website I should mention, decriminalizesexwork.com, that's trying to raise money to specifically challenge the prostitution laws. We've gone after some of the court. So far, we haven't won. The Erotic Service Providers Legal Education Research Project is spearheading this fight and raised money this year at the Up Your Alley and Folsom Street Fair in San Francisco. We'll probably be doing that again next year. So the meetup site, meetup.com/decriminalize if you want to get involved with any of that. But hopefully that answers
I have a couple of things to add, one of which is there are in fact legalized forms of sex work, particularly in the state of California. Sex surrogacy is a recognized therapeutic practice, which has fairly large barriers to entry, and it's really open to people who have the same amount of privilege that any kind of specialized training requires. And of course, the joke goes around, especially with kink.com having just moved out of town, sex work suddenly becomes legal as long as there's a camera there.
Yes.
Right? You can
Yes.
absolutely pay people to have sex for money as long as the transaction is between a viewer and there's a camera intermediating, right? So there are forms of legal sex work that already exist. The second kind of gets back to June's point, which is I personally, as much as I think the legalization of marijuana in the state of California makes absolute sense, I think it's a path to sanity and it's a move in the right direction. And I look at these billboards all over town for dispensaries, and I am enraged that there are still poor kids in jail with criminal records for having sold a little pot.
That's it.
And again, we're getting back to those multiple classes of people who benefits question. I believe that there is an initiative on the ballot right now in the state of California to start expunging the records of people who were nabbed under the drug laws, and particularly to create paths forward into the industry for people who were in the industry before it was legal. But this is what we're dealing with, is that the legalization path really shuts out a lot of people who should not have those barriers to entry.
And Carol, you had something?
Yes, I totally go along with that thrust of the idea of that kind of standard difference we see between, we think of when we think about the difference between legalization and decriminalization, but it's not really defined. And you talk to 10 people and they're going to all have a different idea of what legalization and decriminalization is. And also, an attorney's definitely going to have a different idea. Barbara St. James started, in the beginning of the movement in the early 70s, chose to use the word, it's a statement against this kind of overregulation.
Yeah.
So I always worry that people, kind of take it too seriously. Maybe like in Germany, all over the world, that's not necessarily the way they talk about prostitution. They talk, it just depends on the country. Sometimes if they have laws constructed in a certain way, they're not necessarily going to think decrim as their model, although in Australia they do. So it's really contextual, and it's really something you kind of have, it's good to look into the whole gamut of it, but I do generally feel like we need to say it, to tell people not to have those overregulated systems, because that's what they love to do first.
Yes.
Just my imagination runs away with me. marijuana, can you imagine if R.J. Reynolds started like selling?
I thought they were trying to.
Yeah, well, started selling cigarettes, marijuana cigarettes, and making addictive chemicals in it. Then imagine Hollywood got into prostitution, and then what would happen to that in the movies? And it just, I don't know, I'm just thinking, legalize, you just take it to the extreme, and I don't know, I was just thinking.
I found the passage I was looking for, by the way. This is Crowley's comment on the laws for all, and I think, let's see, he was commenting, looking for the part that he's commenting on here. Let's see, where was it? Yeah, well, anyway, here's what he says. As ye will, in that statement, where is it? It's back there.
Go back a ways.
Yeah. Right, take your fill and will above as ye will, when, where, and with whom ye will. And he's like parsing each part of that. He says, as ye will, it should be abundantly clear from the foregoing remarks that each individual has an absolute and indefeasible right to use his sexual vehicle in accordance with its own proper character, and that he is responsible only to himself. But he should not injure himself in his right aforesaid. Acts invasive of another individual's equal rights are implicitly self-aggressions. So what hurts others is really hurting you because we're all connected. A thief can hardly complain on theoretical grounds if he is himself robbed. Such acts as rape and the assault or seduction of infants may therefore be justly regarded as offenses against the law of liberty and repressed in the interests of that law. It is also excluded from as ye will to compromise the liberty of another person indirectly, as by taking advantage of the ignorance or good faith of another person to expose that person to the constraint of sickness, poverty, social detriment, or childbearing, unless with the well-informed and uninfluenced free will of that person. So I just wanted to share that. So there is an ethical consideration here. It isn't just do whatever you feel like.
Online, there's a whole, like, a decriminalization law from New Zealand, and if you look at it, it doesn't look like what maybe the standard idea of decriminalized. There's tons of regulations. So, what, what's decriminalized? But, there is a great model if you just put decriminalization New Zealand, and then you'll see it.
So that, brings me kind of to my second question is, like, me, I live in a very conservative state. How do I act as, just a regular, everyday schmo, as an advocate for sex workers? Have you seen, like, models of how to approach that subject with people in order to kind of advocate and talk about these laws and the kind of BS that they propound or propose, right? Is there a way that you've seen work in regards to kind of breaking through that conservative, prejudice against, sex work in a very red, Christian state?
Well, I think there's a number of different ways that could be approached. One with this new national legislation is the angle that this is really an attack on free speech and the entire viability of the internet. That Section 230 clause being shot down means that now no site can really feel secure in allowing users to put up content without really having that either policed or just say, we're not even going to get involved in letting people put up that kind of content, anything that might be approaching that area. And this is the chair of the Libertarian Party, Nick Sarwark, really came around to seeing like how important this issue was. Partly from that, partly also just hearing people like Maggie McNeil talk about how the parallels with the war on drugs. A lot of civil liberties have been lost in this country. The war on drugs has been a huge, libertarian issue forever. Searches without warrants, raids on massage parlors, confiscation. And this happens all the time, and police corruption. Sex workers talk about cops basically raping them, having sex with them, and then the sex workers feel like they can't say anything. It would be targeted. I just recently heard a case where, and this happened to this woman apparently like 3 times in the past year in South San Francisco, and SFPD actually may have been involved supposedly. I've been trying to find out more information because I'm not sure what they were even doing down there, but basically she was robbed $1,000, no charges filed. They basically just took the money, and I'm sure it never even probably got reported or made its way into a police report. It's just, legalized robbery. Oh, you have too much cash on you. You must have gotten this from criminal enterprise. We're just going to take it.
Yeah, the forfeiture law.
Civil asset forfeiture is a term. They use this under the law specifically to get around Fourth Amendment protections, because they say, oh, well, you're not being charged with a crime. If it even makes it to court, they'll say your property is being charged with a crime. There's actually cases on the books that'll have something like United States or People versus 1997 Ford Cavalier or something. They'll charge a piece of property, like a car or money or something with a crime rather than charging the person with a crime, as a way to get around giving people their due process rights under the law.
Oh, I have a question.
So much.
Yeah, well, it's a question and kind of a comment on the whole thing, because I think a big part of this is, we haven't really got into, is the technological side of things. When you have companies like Facebook, Google, things like that are, doing a lot of things with their data, a lot of things that we don't necessarily know about, and a lot of potentially nefarious things, social engineering things at that scale. I guess the question is well, I guess it's more, I'm just going to throw some things out there. I think one of the ways that we can organize more effectively and better, even in red states like you're saying, is through using emerging technologies that haven't yet been usurped by the bigger companies. And what I'm talking about is decentralized computing in a way that we can...
A new internet?
A new internet, yes. Basically. So rebooting the internet using the communication tools we already have. Everyone in here has a smartphone with the ability, we could host applications and we can make contracts between everyone in this room, for example, social contracts, and we could say, okay, well, this is what this group, this is the rules we agree upon, and we could do that kind of work, right? And so it's a way to work kind of underneath the system in a sense, but it also and the technology, it's open source technology, so there's a lot of brilliant coders all over the world working on it.
Fantastic.
Yeah, so
Until somebody is friends with a Fed.
What's up?
Until someone is friends with a Fed.
Right.
Yeah.
Right, and then
it's over.
Then you have to
That's
start
how
another one up.
pirate
Then you
went.
start
So
another one up.
I can actually kind of speak to that as well, and because you're referring to blockchain, right? Blockchain technology, and so there's a few things that present challenges in regards to the distributed to a distributed internet. And the number one is a distributed DNS, right? So if we can overcome some of these technical challenges, you're absolutely right.
Well, we have enough people that own private servers.
Right,
I'm saying is
right.
we don't have to rely on companies like Facebook and Google and things like that to store all of our data and do with what they please.
Absolutely.
Because what ends up happening is you have apps like Tinder and things like that uses metrics brought in by Facebook to make selections and things like that, and basically taking the magic or the freedom of eros out of the process of mate selection and things like that.
Right.
So that's where I get.
So yeah, I mean that data can be distributed, and there's a lot of stuff being presented, like a lot of technologies that are being presented to be able to do that.
Algorithms for the women that you choose, or
right.
the sex workers you choose?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, no. What I'm saying is that the technology, I think the technology has outstripped the advertising aspect of the technology has outstripped the social networking purpose. I mean, the whole data breach with Facebook that just came out. It's like it came out that they were doing social experiments within Facebook on users of Facebook, things like that. So what I'm saying is that, I mean, for me personally, I'm going to avoid the Facebook mechanism moving forward and work on these new platforms that are emerging. That the idea is to, I liked what you said about the Libertarian Party and the non-aggression principle and no force or fraud against others. And so that's the idea, is that you can have this safe space where there is no force, there is no fraud. It's just,
No
just
initiation of force or fraud.
exactly. You're just, and then from that space, it's like then you can. It's like well, then what? Where do we go from there?
Let me interject here, and then we have another comment.
Sure.
This kind of talk is about getting around a law like FOSTA-SESTA, but the problem is that we're still living in a society where people try to set up these laws. We still live in a society where they'll always keep running after the frontier. And the problem is we need to raise consciousness about these issues so that more and more people understand that the whole project to stop trafficking, right, or whatever, is wrong-headed in the first place.
Yeah.
Instead of trying to get around the law, try to educate the society enough so that you don't have to keep trying to fight and get around laws like this. Keith, you had something.
So it seems that in the current environment, the tangle that we're in is this sort of Gordian knot between we want to have the liberty to engage in these sorts of adult consensual transactions on the one side, and there does exist a legitimate problem of especially child sex trafficking, but even adult sex trafficking, that is a legitimate concern. And I'd be curious if any of the panelists have any thoughts about how to cut that particular knot.
Well, I don't want to see it that way because, see, all the issues that they've lumped into trafficking, the abuse, the exploitation, yes, those, we have concerns about all those, we all know those issues. But the trafficking as it's been constructed, I think isn't actually a real thing. It's just something that gets us to think about violence a certain way. So all the exploitation, everything else is real. It's like the framework of how we're supposed to think about it is not real. So I think that basically what we need to do is go through and address all of these things, issues that have things in common. We do need to organize, but it doesn't necessarily to help to, take an immigrant and a homeless youth and then think about and then get riled up about their problems and then arrest sex workers. I mean, that's kind of an extreme, but that's kind of what it's doing. So I don't know. Trafficking, I'm not sure that the trafficking framework, I think, is just problematic. But I see the movement perhaps moving towards something else. The harm reduction people are starting to use other words and starting to look at what the real culprits are and the real problems are, which is all this exploitation and abuse.
Just like your single issue would be sex with children or kidnap or something like that. Just those single issues instead of this big umbrella that catches all. Yeah, there's already
things that are connected, or things that are connected. But this model is something that has an age-old history of being about targeting prostitutes and immigrants.
Right.
Well, and one of the true outcomes of FOSTA-SESTA is it, by marginalizing, by getting this off of mainstream platforms, we've actually reduced the ability of law enforcement to have critical insight into when somebody underage is being predated, when an immigrant is being predated, like the very real issues that are obscured by this frame. FOSTA does exactly the opposite of what one would do to deal with the issue, and it's the same issue with criminalization.
And one more thing, and also the real problems for the community. So it's not like we have the children being abused and this and that. What we have actually is the real problems for these communities, immigrants, is totally separate than this whole trafficking thing. That's what we need to start.
And Starchild, you had something?
Yeah. So generally, and I pretty much agree with everything Carol Leight and Miriam have been saying. The usual kind of response from the sex work rights community has been that when you criminalize people, not just that the law enforcement has a harder time identifying the real problems, but that people feel sex workers and clients themselves and others who might be in a position to see actual abuses going on are afraid to come forward because they risk being persecuted themselves. And something else that related to the trafficking issue, I think a lot of, and I do think there is some actual trafficking. I will differ a little bit with Curly on that.
I'm not saying there's not.
Well, I think what often happens, a lot of it has to do with the immigration laws, not just in this country, but anywhere that labor is prevented from going to where economic opportunity is. There's a lot of poor people out there in the world who are trying to come to wealthier countries like the United States because there's more economic opportunity. Because of the criminalization of freedom of movement, it's not that easy necessarily to get into the United States. So often they will pay people, smugglers, coyotes, they call them from Mexico, Latin America, to help them get in the country. And a lot of times, because they have no money, they can't afford to pay up front. So they make arrangements, okay, you'll have me get in, I'll pay the money back by working after I get here. So they might get here with the help of a smuggler and go to work, say, in a massage parlor. And there it's consensual, they're working to pay back their debt to the smuggler, but the massage parlor gets raided, say. And everybody's arrested, and at that point, the worker has a rather stark choice that's basically being engineered for them by the government. They can say, I'm here, I'm working as a prostitute, it's consensual, I'm trying to pay back my smuggler, etc., and tell the truth. In which case, they'll probably be arrested, maybe deported, face other unpleasant consequences. Or they can say, I was sex trafficked here, being held against my will, in which case they may be eligible for refugee status, various kinds of official help and so forth. They might be able to stay in the country, etc. Perverse incentives are created that actually inflate the trafficking beyond what actually exists in terms of it being coercive trafficking, if that makes sense.
And even, as I'm hearing you explain that scenario, let's say that it's not exactly consensual. They're doing it because they have to, right? They have to pay back the smuggler. That's all they could do, or they didn't know what they were getting into, Well, who set up the situation where they had to go through that to get here?
Right.
The government.
Exactly. They're the biggest
Right.
pimp of all.
Right. So the smugglers and whoever runs the massage parlor are taking advantage of a situation of desperation that they didn't set up. They're taking advantage of. The government set it up.
But I don't think all of them are taking advantage. I don't want to preach, because those
Well,
people
right,
always get
yeah.
demonized, and there are some that deserve to be demonized who are really exploiting, but there's also, just like there's good landlords, there's good, managers in any business, and there's also people who are jerks, right?
We're out of time. I want to thank the wonderful panel for showing up. This has been really